Hi, welcome to Read Pop Pride Week. We are here with the LGBTQ voices in YA and middle grade. My name is Samantha Puc. I'll be moderating. And then first and foremost, I would love it if each of our panelists could introduce themselves, tell us your name, your pronouns, and then a bit about your work. And if you'd like, you can also tell us your favorite thing about creating LGBTQ books for younger readers. Whoever wants to go first.
Starting. Come on.
So who starts?
Whoever wants to go first.
You got to read. Come on.
All right, I'll go. My name's Blas. I've already forgot the instructions that you've asked me to do. I am the author of Deadweight, the co-author of Deadweight, Murder at Camp Bloom, which I co-authored with Molly Muldoon. That's illustrated by Matthew Seeley. And I am the author of Hotel Dare, which was illustrated by, oh, no, this way, Claudia.
That's me.
Over here. I love like YA middle grade stuff because I'm sure we can get into this later, but my favorite thing about it is showing representation for queer characters in YA, because I think the message that kids are sent when they don't see themselves represented in cartoons and in comics is that they don't exist. And that's not okay with me. So that's my favorite thing is representing for queer kids.
Cool.
Well, my name is Claudia Aguirre. I am a Mexican comic book artist, and my favorite thing about doing YA and middle grade stuff is that I get to live the things I couldn't read and experience as a kid. And my favorite bit is especially doing Hotel There with Terry, having adventures and writing and seeing kids that look like me in the pages, that being Mexican on the pages, and those were things we didn't get in Mexico even. Mm-hmm. So I'm really proud and I'm really happy I get to do this.
Very cool. All right, who's next?
I'll go next. Hi, I'm Trung, also known as Trungles. I use he, him, and they, them pronouns, and I have a debut graphic novel coming up through Penguin Random House, same as Jessi, actually. And it's called The Magic Fish. And my favorite thing about YA and middle grade stories is that it's a space where I can tell stories that are really small. Like when you're younger, your feelings occupy such a huge portion of your life and you're going through a lot of kind of difficulties and challenges for the very first time. So particularly if you're a queer kid, if you're a kid of color, if you're an immigrant, like it's very rare to see your kind of minute struggles, like the little things that you wish someone would validate in your experiences, kind of pop up anywhere in the media. So I find it to be really wonderful to explore the little stories and the little moments that make being a kid such a difficult and wonderful thing.
Very cool.
And I'm Jessi Zabarsky. I have Witchlight.
Match.
I'm she, her. And I mainly do like fantasy, adventure, sci-fi, whatever, YA stories. And I just really love that I'm able to express things and put the kinds of people into that I want to into the stories that I really loved as a kid. That like I'm still a big fan of young adult fantasy novels, but I get to like do it my way and just be selfish about it, and people like it.
Very cool. So several of you touched on this a little bit about one of the things that you really like about middle grade and YA, but can you recall the first time that you actually saw yourself reflected in something that you read or watched and how that made you feel?
I honestly didn't get to feel that until I was a teenager. But really it wasn't that groundbreaking for me because at least in Mexico, I live in Mexico. I'm Mexican, so I'm just completely immersed in my own culture. So basically, everything's whitewashed. There's no native characters. There's no brown Mexicans in media. So seeing a queer character in TV who was Xena, the warrior princess, the whole not being indigenous at that time wasn't that groundbreaking, but seeing someone who was queer and unapologetic at being queer was really something for me. I was like, I don't know, 13 or something like that. And even though I couldn't really grasp what was it, there was something there that made me like feel that she was like me in a way. Then seeing myself as a character, as a Mexican woman in a story, it didn't come until I was an adult. So I think this comes again to the fact that I want to make stories with people like me as a main character, because I couldn't see it until I was a teenager, and I couldn't see myself as a Mexican in media until I was an adult.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think there's characters that like as a kid you relate to, but that you don't necessarily like really identify with necessarily. Like, you know, I think a lot of queer kids are like, yeah, X-Men because whatever, but then there's not like one that specifically speaks to you because of their queerness or whatever necessarily.
Mm-hmm.
And for me, I was also an adult. The first time I feel like I saw myself represented in like a book or a movie or a show was like Justin Suarez from like Ugly Betty. It's like this like young Mexican American boy who was super into fashion and Golden Girls. And like, especially in the States, you don't usually see many queer like Latino representations, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And so that was for me really groundbreaking to see kind of this kid that I felt like that was pretty much me growing up. And so I think it's interesting that we can find these parallels in like TV, but that I think it speaks to why we need them more in like books and comics.
Mm-hmm. Okay. And so building off of that a little bit, when you embark on creating the stories that you get to make now, what are some of the things that you take into consideration, not just from a representation perspective, but from like a story perspective? What are the kinds of things that you want readers who are younger to be able to experience when they pick up one of your books?
I think storytelling-wise, one of the things that I tried really hard to keep in mind was to not make the story about edifying the reader. Like, it wasn't about like, oh, okay, this is going to be an issues book and I'm going to write a story that will educate the world about this particular perspective. I really just wanted to tell a story about like a kid whose struggles and particular life journey segments really reflected a lot of mine in a lot of ways. I wanted to kind of make sure that the story and the narrative flowed along in a way that centers the experiences and the priorities of where people are in their lives without all of the context that we have as adults, because it comes off oftentimes as sort of paternalistic. You kind of feel like you're talking down to an audience when you're trying to be like a source of knowledge when you're telling a story and you're not trying to necessarily moralize or educate. And so that was kind of something that I wanted to maybe impress a little bit, is that if you are a queer person, if you're a person of color, if you exist in any marginalized identity of society, it's not your job to exist to make people feel a little bit more cosmopolitan because they know you. It's you need to be able to find the things that bring you joy, like you for yourself. And I think that that's kind of where my storytelling priorities ended up.
Very cool.
I think it's similar for me that I don't think I'll have any interest in having a story where queerness is like a problem. That like it's just like, okay, there are world problems in any fantasy world, but it's not going to be that these two girls kiss. Like, that's whatever, you know. Everybody is just like, yeah, and that it's just presented very smoothly. When I was originally making Witchlight back in like 2013 through 16, I was actually very worried that it wouldn't come off as queer enough, because I was just like, I'm just writing this like the kind of romance I like to read, and that's very low key and just like, yeah, they just like blush sometimes and, you know, talk about their feelings, and like there's not you know, a big romantic moment really. They've got other things to do.
Like storytelling wise, for me, I think it's important, especially in Hotel Dare. I established right away that this young kid, that she's queer, and then after that, she gets to go on an adventure. Like she's 14, so I wanted her story to be about this like awesome adventure she goes on versus like necessarily all these crushes and things or whatever she might have, which those kinds of stories I think are valid. But I think, in my opinion, I would like the next sort of like push for storytelling for queer characters to be about the adventures they go on or the stories that they inhabit, where, like Jessi said, their queerness isn't a problem.
Yeah, I think I also kind of want to echo what Jessi mentioned too, is that oftentimes when we tell stories about our own queernesses and our own experiences about queerness, there is this sense of like, we're not, like, it won't be read as queer enough. And I often wonder how often that is because queerness and coming out and all the experiences of being a young queer person under the protection of someone else, when you don't have a lot of agency, when you're in that age group, how much of it is tied up with trauma and how much of it is tied up with, you know, suffering and difficulty. And so when you tell a story about queerness without pain, it becomes kind of confusing to some people. And I want us to move away from that. And I'm really happy to hear that that's kind of what everyone's doing.
I think I want to expand on that, actually. I'm sorry. I don't
No, go for it. Please go for it.
I wanted to expand on that, actually. What I try to do, or what we've been trying to do, is to actually move on to the queer joy and avoid the pieces of media that's been traumatizing us and telling us that our stories must be sort of cathartic from our trauma, so we can show this pain to the world, so we can be a valid minority. But that's just terrible, and that's not the kind of stories. I mean, I love drama. I'm all the way super dramatic. I love it. And of course, there's forbidden romances. There's stuff on that on my stories. But like at some point, they have to let go of that trauma, and I want media to also let go from that and start experiencing queer joy. And we want queers to go on adventures, queers who slay dragons, queers who fall in love, but it's also not the central part of the story when you're telling a fantasy story. Like I don't want to reduce my female or male characters inside their queerness to just a romantic interest for someone else. I want them to be the heroes of the story, and that's part of the queer joy I want to impose in a way in my storytelling. I want to move on from "you're not allowed to do this" or to exist this way because I don't think you deserve it, to, you know what, I am the hero and I'm going to do whatever I want. That's what I want.
Hell yeah. So I think that, I mean, especially like growing up, I mean, I didn't read like authentic queer content until I was probably in my early 20s. And that was when I started kind of encountering, you know, queer relationships and things like that in the books that I was reading. And so I'm curious about how each of you feels when you first started creating stories. Was your focus on queer joy at that point? And did you find that it was harder to get those stories sort of seen because there was such a focus on queer trauma up until very recently? Or is that something that's kind of grown and changed over time?
I think for me, especially speaking of experience in a Mexican setting, which is extremely homophobic and stuff like that, I started doing comics about like 8 years ago. And 8 years ago, it wasn't that bad for you guys, but it wasn't really a thing outside of the yaoi circles, anime and manga, and anime and manga with queer characters consumed by straight people. That is literally all there was back then, and I was not into it because those stories are not being told to me. They're not made by people like me or for me. So I honestly I was kind of closeted because I didn't know what I wanted to do story-wise. So at some point, it clicked to me that no one was doing what I should be doing, and I felt it like my responsibility to be the first queer woman out there doing small press stories. I even we published a bunch of queer-centered adventure stories. They're also out now. I hope we get to do them again. But at some point, I felt a responsibility to do that. It wasn't at first. I was kind of closeted in a way, but yeah, it wasn't like that. It was great, gradual, and it was. I felt like I was being untrue to myself, so I said, let's do it. I'm gonna be the first lesbian woman doing comics in Mexico. So I just went to it.
That's awesome.
Then all the others came there after me, and so it was really great to see a bunch of lesbians just doing comics over here. Just beautiful.
And I mean, when it comes to sort of exploring queer issues at all, I know that at least like Deadweight explores sort of themes of homophobia and fatphobia and things of that nature. So when you do decide to include those things, how do you do so in a way that is respectful of the kind of content that you want to create, in the sense that you're still representing queer joy, but also deals with sort of the more serious aspects that younger readers probably are having to deal with in their real lives and not just in the books that they read?
I guess using Deadweight as an example, I felt like the solution there for me was to show, I call it the more than one thing. So there's a young gay boy at this weight loss camp, and he's not really fat, but he thinks he's fat because he's gay. And so right there, that speaks to a little bit of sort of like that part of the culture. But there's also a young, big lesbian girl at this camp, and she doesn't have any issue with being queer or gay, and neither does her father, who is the person who sends her to this camp. It's the issue he has is that she's overweight. And so I wanted there to be a character who utilizes her strengths and her queerness and these things about her as like a strong ability to make friends and solve a mystery. Like, I don't know how else to put it, I guess, other than like those things about her that she's probably been told by other people are wrong. She doesn't believe that. And that's what helps her, I think, stand out and help these other kids solve a mystery. But yeah, to have another kid there who's like, because he's queer, he's told that he's fat, but he's not really, I think was also an important kind of piece of that representation. But he doesn't care, I think, that he doesn't have an issue with being gay. He has an issue with being overweight.
Right, which that's, like you said, kind of a whole other can of worms, especially in the queer community.
But I didn't want there to ever be a moment where the plus size characters in Deadweight are a joke for being big. That was like the whole point of the book. Was in other stories, I feel like when you have characters who are overweight, or like the fat character, they're relegated to this idea of like the joke, or like the funny fat friend who has a lot of good advice but can't, get a date. And I thought, if the baseline for all these characters is that they're all big, then what else is it about their personalities that's interesting or fun that we want to follow them in a story? So yeah, I feel like I had one joke that was questionable, and I was like, let's just remove it.
And in terms of sort of making things the baseline, building off the idea of having, more than one, I feel like for a long time, queerness was relegated to like, okay, there's one background character who is queer and they have one line where they're very explicitly queer and that's it. That's the only exploration of their identity that we ever get. So is that something that you feel helps to sort of form stories that not only are true to life, because there are obviously queer communities and groups of friends? I mean, my group of friends doesn't have very many straight people in it at all. When you are creating your characters and creating those worlds, is that something that you think about consciously, like making that sort of a baseline expectation? Or is it something that just happens because those are the stories that you like to tell?
Well, in nature, the gays travel in packs. So it's just
True.
part of nature. I think you cannot have a believable gay character without a support community.
Mm-hmm.
We thrive in community. That's how it's always been. So just relegating the queerness to one character is just like trying to embody all the bad things of a community in one person. So you can be the stereotype, and you cannot have a bunch of queer people being either good or bad or fat or thin, a femme or butch. Like you have so many beautiful bodies and personalities to choose from, and just instead of just having one person embody all of them. I think it's quite boring to have just one.
Mhm. I think for me, that sort of depends on the kind of story that I'm telling. I know that we as adults, like so much of queer community building is finding other people and creating a community of found family for yourself. But I think especially for stories that are, for centered for young adults or for like children in middle grade fiction, children don't really have like a lot of agency. Like we'll have friends and, we'll like reach out and we'll connect with each other. But oftentimes I think the experience of being queer and isolated, because you're not born into people who like are necessarily always queer or understanding. So that feeling of loneliness and isolation in your queerness is something that a lot of kids do experience. And so I think it depends on what part of a person's life you really want to represent. Like sometimes you have the means to, travel in packs and like have a lot of queer friends. And that's something that I cherish as an adult. But as a kid, I did not get that. So I think it depends really where you are in your life.
Yeah, absolutely.
I
for sure.
had sort of a similar experience that I did not figure out my own queerness until like relatively recently, like within the last 5+ years. I think partially because I didn't have a lot of people around me who were queer, and partially because I felt normal. And everything that I knew about being any flavor of queer was that, you were different from other people and you had this special existence, whether good or bad, but like you were interested in this particular kind of thing and you expressed yourself in this particular kind of way, and that wasn't me. So I was like, well, I don't fit in there, but I have these feelings, but and I think that definitely comes through just naturally in the kind of stories that I write, because it's just like I said, I just present everything as like, well, it's just, this is the world. And there's no hurdles or boxes or anything to trip people up.
And building on that a little bit, when it comes to telling stories about characters whose identities or experiences you don't necessarily share, how do you make sure that you do so in a way that's respectful and that creates positive representation for every group that's represented in your book?
For me, particularly, fantasy helps a lot for that. Because I would not be confident presenting like an actual lesbian Mexican experience, because I'm not qualified for that. But making sure that just there are different kinds of faces and bodies all throughout main and secondary and tertiary and crowd scenes and everywhere, and that it's not just it's just boring. You know, and it feels unnatural if it's just all one kind of person. Like, you know, even when I was living in rural Ohio, it, you know, which is very white and conservative, like it felt unnatural to, you know, to not have different kinds of people, because even there are different kinds of people. You know,
Mhm.
even the fantasy should reflect real life at least a little bit.
For sure.
I think this is a problem that kind of happens on two tiers a little bit, and we have a lot of trouble discussing it because whenever we talk about kind of like diversity in general, we don't really draw strong delineations between diverse casts of characters in a work of fiction and a diverse like workplace, diverse personnel, and like representation in real life, like behind the page. And so I think oftentimes like the best answer that I can give is like, if you're one person, you can't think about diversity as a failure of your individual imagination, but you do have a responsibility to make a world where where you extend empathy to the people who are in your life. You're going to be surrounded by people who are different than you. You're going to be surrounded by people whose experiences are different than you. And so you do have a responsibility to do your research and make sure that they are included in your fictional imaginary universes to the best of your ability. But beyond that, you kind of have to make sure that you're not claiming an authority over their experiences when you're putting them in your stories. And so what that does is that oftentimes we tell the stories and we center the experiences that we know best. And what that does is that within an industry that's very homogenous, you do get a lot of the same perspectives over and over and over. And so at the individual level, authors are oftentimes doing their very best to make sure to stay in their lane. But within the broader industry, we don't hire enough creators of color. We don't hire enough Black creators, queer creators, creators with disabilities, fat creators. Like, we have like an industry problem, and those people need to have space within this system in order to tell their stories. But I think like so far everyone's kind of doing the best that they can, and being like the perfect representative of like all diversity in one person is a really unfair thing to put on a person. And I think authors of color and marginalized authors feel that the most. Like, we want to be incredibly responsible about the way that we convey or imagine the people in our lives who we love and respect, but we don't have their experiences. And to claim authority over their experiences is something that we don't want to do. But it's also not something within our ken to control within a system of which we're only a very small part.
For sure. And I know that recently there's been a pretty significant shift toward more publishers hiring sensitivity editors and like authenticity readers. Do you feel that in conjunction with sort of opening the creative field to more marginalized creators will create a space where more authentic representation becomes the norm, versus now where it seems to be something that we kind of struggle with as an industry? I know that's kind of a heavy question.
I guess I would say that I think it's a good first step.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
But I think the problem you might run into is, say, like with all the controversy this past year with like the novel American Dirt, the question was like, was there no Latino or Mexican person that worked there or that you could find to hire as a sensitivity reader? But even if they had, who's to say that that one person's Mexican experience spoke to the experience of what that was being portrayed in this book? So again, the idea of more than one is somewhat helpful.
Yeah.
And I guess I don't fully believe that it's difficult to find. Like, the fastest growing demographic in the United States currently is the college educated Latina. So you can't tell me that there's not Latinas who want to work in publishing that are difficult to find. Like, that is not the case. So I think it's a good first step. But I also would like to echo, I think, what Jessi said about like fantasy and sci-fi being this sort of good vehicle for producing stories about about maybe not about, but that include people who aren't necessarily like you or share your experience. You know, if you have, like in Hotel Dare, there's like a lesbian couple, and one of them is a fish lady and this black space pirate lady. And so they're not from our world. So she may not have experienced like a technical experience of what it means to be a Black American, but it's a way to have cool representation for this awesome lady that has like cool hologram weapons who happens to be a woman of color. And I think it also speaks to, like, to your question, speaks to the idea of like maybe diversifying the group of people in your life. Because if you don't have anyone in, I would ask, my first question would be, why do you want to include this kind of character in your story? And the second question would be, if it's for a good justifiable reason, then do you not have anyone in your life that you can ask or hire to be a sensitivity reader for you? So I don't know. I don't know if that answers your question.
I think I want to echo what Terry said early on too, is that it's a good first step. Like sensitivity readers are something that is necessary right now, but we eventually need to move the industry beyond the need for them, in that what will happen if sensitivity readers being hired becomes common practice and becomes the new status quo is that we'll have like still the same like kind of white authors at the top, like the same kind of homogenous people at the top being the authors, and then a coterie of like handmaiden roles assigned to people of color to support their narratives. And so we need to eventually elevate the people who like we would consider to be sensitivity readers to become authors. Like we need to do that.
Then you might not have to pay a sensitivity reader.
Exactly.
Or a different kind of sensitivity reader.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of in the same vein, I'm curious about how each of you feels about the way that queer representation in middle grade and young adult books is increasing, because it does seem as though LGBTQ characters and creators are becoming more visible in these markets. And so I'm curious about kind of how you think that trend is, how you think it started, and where you think it's going, or where you hope to see it go in the near future.
For me, I'm very heartened by it. A lot of the others have said about, you know, the more than one thing applies to just books in general, as well as individual characters, that not too long ago, around when I was starting Witchlight, I was frustrated with the kind of queer comics that I was finding at conventions and stuff, because it was like, it was again a little narrow. People were doing good work, but it wasn't for me. And but it was like there weren't enough people making it, so you know, you only had a few things to choose from. And just like last year, I had the experience of like going to my local library and getting a bunch of comics out, and there was one that was pretty much all queer characters, but I just wasn't clicking with the story, and I have enough options now that I was able to just be like, I'm not gonna read this, it's fine. I can read something else, and that's wonderful. And hope that just keeps going.
Yeah. Well, and that's the thing too, is I feel like there's a lot more choice now than there used to be. Like you were saying, I feel like there are so many more, especially in comics, so many more comics that have, you know, queer characters and queer narratives and queer themes that you can approach. Because for somebody who doesn't like fantasy, say, or who doesn't like sci-fi, there are slice of life comics, and there are things of that nature that can be sort of picked up and enjoyed, which I think is really cool. So as far as your own creations, what sort of impact are you hoping to make on not just the industry, because I think that that's a hard question to answer, but on your readers? What is it that you hope that your readers take away from reading the stories that you've created?
Well, personally, I just want more people to make their stories. I want to inspire others to just start doing their own thing. There was this experience that just completely destroyed me. Two of them actually. I went to this convention on the other side of the world, and I was just hanging out and selling my stuff. I say, oh my gosh, I can't believe you're here because I started drawing because of you. And that completely destroyed me. I didn't know someone on the other side of the world would be watching whatever I do and the stories I write and the stories I draw. And it was completely, absolutely mind blowing. And this little girl back home, uh, she was with her cousin, I think. The cousin is about 17 or something like that. And she was like 13, 14 when I met her. And they just stopped on my table. And she was head to toe the very same character that was in the cover of the book I was selling. It was Morning in America, and it's about a girl that looks exactly like her. The girl is Mexican. She's very rebellious, and she was wearing the same clothes she was wearing. And I pointed it to her like, "You look exactly like this girl right here." And she was like, "Oh my God, I must get it. I love it. She looks like me." I had never seen any story that with a girl that looks exactly like me. So her cousin bought the book, and he messaged me like 3 months ago that he wanted to buy the rest of the books because he was so completely in love with the story, and that he was working on a novel with this girl, that they wanted to show it to me because they were so inspired by seeing themselves in the book that they wanted to show me the very same thing that I did for them. And it was, oh my God, it was amazing. That is what I want.
I guess it's a little soapboxy, but it's an important issue for me. Is I hope with my work to represent the intersectionality of queer and Latino, and especially because I feel like the country that I live in has quite often a very poor view of Mexican and Latino people. And it's one that they just don't understand or know. They don't know anything about the largest ethnic minority group in the country, which also has the least amount of representation across media. I don't think a lot of people know that before, I guess, COVID-19, every weekend, Latinos accounted for 25% of all movie ticket sales. And so that's an entire quarter of that market. And so we spend more money on media than a lot of other groups, yet don't have that representation. And when we do have that representation, especially for Latin women, it's usually either like a maid or like a sex object.
Yes.
And I felt like if Latinas are the fastest growing demographic, surely they can have representation for being cool or brave or interesting or tough or any other qualities than like sexy and the help. So when I wrote Hotel Dare, it was important for me that 3 of these characters were Mexican women, some of them were queer, and that the artist that we worked with was a queer Mexican woman. So for me, I hope to show representation for a group that in the next 10 to 15 years will be an entire quarter of this country. Because I feel like when you can't see yourself, like I said, when you can't see yourself represented, then you have a difficult time believing that you could do certain things. So that's what I hope for.
I think I don't really have specific hopes for what I want my readers to take away from my book. I kind of recognize that, you know, when you put a work out in the world, the relationship between the person who consumes it and the work is going to be different than the person who made it and the work. So everybody's relationship with it is going to be different. But one thing that I think about a lot is that I keep hearing from educators that oftentimes whenever they teach a book and they have a book in the classroom, it'll often be like, oh, it'll be like a cis male character. And we wonder about why that is all the time. And there's this sentiment that like, you know, like young girls and queer people and people of color, like just have a greater sense of empathy, and they can have an easier time like reading these books and like, you know, getting to know these characters that are different from themselves. And I think so much about who it is that we expect to exercise empathy and who we kind of let get away with not having to consume any experiences by someone whose life doesn't reflect their own. I don't find it necessarily to be that I want to be a representative of where I come from. I am telling my own stories because I expect that my readers, all of them, no matter who they are compassionate individuals who will be able to exercise their sense of empathy no matter who they are. And so I think whatever the relationship that they have with it, I hope that they'll be able to find a way to kind of practice a part of themselves that can relate to someone that does not reflect them.
Bouncing
That's
off
beautiful.
of, when I had this this realization when I was in college that I was making a lot of comics, and most of them had to do with my own angsty feelings, but I was making all of them with white, cis, straight male characters to express my own feelings because I thought that was like the most blank slate kind of character that anybody could project onto. And I realized I was doing this and was like, why am I doing that? I should probably learn to not do that. And I think since then I've been moving more and more towards specificity and expecting that people can just relate to a very specific, weird, messy person that isn't like themselves, but they're in an interesting story. So just, it's fine. And that I don't know, my experience making Witchlight and the next thing I'm working on has been a lot of me just doing exactly what I want to do, and nobody has stopped me yet. So that's kind of what I want readers to take away from it. Like you can tell your specific weird thing, and people will find it and like it, and just do a good job.
Awesome. Okay, I think we have a couple of audience questions, and then I think we'll be wrapping up. So the first question is, does diversity and inclusion come kind of second nature to you, or do you find yourself making conscious efforts to make sure that you have good representation?
I think it depends on the
Yeah.
story. But I remember reading something once that said, does this character need to be a man? Does this character need to be white? Like, if you can't relate to, I don't think that, I think more often than not, people don't realize that they relate to characters not because they're necessarily very similar to them, but because they relate to the emotion that that character feels because they have also felt it. So like when I was 8 years old and I went to the movies, I didn't fall in love with and relate to the Little Mermaid because I was a redheaded fish girl. I related to her because she wanted, more out of life, wanted to be like, where people are and experience things about the world. I think that's what I think people realize is that you can relate to characters who don't necessarily look like you, but that share those emotions. I'm doing a book right now about New York and this young Mexican girl's experience living there. And I thought, what is the most well-known story, popular thing in media about New York that I can think of? And it was Friends. But when I lived in New York, I lived in the Bronx and I didn't see a single white person for like 2 years. So that's not my experience of New York City. So it doesn't make any sense for me to create a story about New York where everybody's white. So I think it's a good question because in a way it does come second nature, but then I think in the back of our minds we are always trying to sort of be conscious now in our writing about like not everybody in this has to be like the same type of person.
As a white person, I would like to say that it comes naturally. I think to a certain extent it does, but it's still something that is like a active check that I do. That like something that I did early on in Witchlight when I was making any sort of, you know, drawing a panel that had, you know, more than one character in it that were, you know, like a crowd scene or something. I just had a separate piece of paper that I drew like 30 different people on that was just like, okay, just draw all of these people that I can place in different crowd panels. And through having them all laid out together, I could make sure that, you know, I was varying body types and skin colors and facial features and hair and all that kind of stuff. And, you know, being conscious of the bias that white people have of like thinking, oh, you know, it's 20% non-white people, and so that means it's half and half. And it's like, no, it shouldn't even be half white people and half people of color. It should be less than that white people, and so it's actually equal between different groups. And, you know, just having, you know, to do those kinds of checks to make sure, you know, that I'm not letting my own bias and, you know, my own like just lost the word, the thinking under the top layer, subconscious, take a hold of my pencil, that being more intentional about it.
Cool. All right, and then we have another audience question, which is, was there something from your own life experience that you particularly enjoyed writing or drawing into your books?
Hi, Ethan.
Oh my gosh, it's Ethan. Hi.
Everybody, if you're watching, check out Ethan's work too. He wrote and illustrated Estranged, which is a great series of queer characters.
Mhm.
Nice.
I enjoyed writing like Mexican pastries into my books. And those are from my childhood, and I'm obsessed with them. So it's fun to write those in, but also like being a little queer kid who was obsessed with certain things that could be deemed girly, like unicorns or things like that. Hotel Dare was created so that I could just kitchen sink style throw everything that I loved into a book. So there's like wizards and unicorns and space pirates and aliens. There's all kinds of stuff in there, because those are things I loved. But in terms of my experience, I think that writing a young boy who is seen, like every character in Hotel Dare is a woman except for two boys. And those boys are both sweet and kind and gentle, because I felt it was important for boys to see that those qualities aren't weak. And I considered myself, I guess, as a kid to be a gentle child boy. And so I wanted to show that experience as well, because I felt like that was valid.
I don't know so much about experiences necessarily. I feel like when I think about the work that went into my book, my personal experiences inform the narrative, but the stuff that I like to draw come from like kind of a different place. It comes from like my personal interests. And so it was kind of an excuse for me to draw a lot of fairy tales and like kind of explore the history of like gowns as well, depending on where people come from and where princesses exist in the popular imagination. It kind of got me to really indulge and ask questions about like, why do things look this way? And that's kind of the personal indulgent thing that I put into my books.
Cool. All right, Jessi or Claudia?
Well, I'm going to echo Trung because I really don't like putting much of myself into an avatar of a story. Instead, I just indulge a lot on what I want to see in stories, or like I try to think, what would child Claudia would be really psyched about? What would make her freak out if I did it now, and if she saw it, what I'm doing right now. So I try to indulge in that spark that I had back then, instead of drawing from my own life, because I feel like I have a very particular upbringing and life experience that I think of it as really privileged. So I prefer to draw from my interests instead of my own life.
Sure. Okay. I think that just about wraps up this panel. Thank you all for joining me for this. This was a really great discussion. Before we sign off, is there anything that you want to add? Anybody that you want to shout out? Anything you want to tell the world?
Read Until There.
Yeah. It's this book right here.
It's really fun. Terry did a great job.
So did Claudia.
And I believe that there are links in the comments to pick up the Magic Fish, Witchlight, and Hotel Dare. So definitely check those out. And yeah, thank you guys so much for joining me for this. And I hope that everybody watching tunes in for the rest of Pop Pride Week. I think that's all. I think we'll sign off with that. Thank you guys so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, everyone. Bye.
Monday.